400 feet beneath the surface, the submarine was dying. The air inside was toxic, thick with carbon dioxide and the smell of unwashed bodies. The temperature had reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Men were collapsing from heat exhaustion. The cooling system had failed days ago. The batteries were nearly dead. Communication with Moscow had been lost for hours. And now, American destroyers circled overhead, dropping practice depth charges that exploded like thunder against the hull, each one closer than the last. The captain was screaming. The political officer was screaming. They had a nuclear torpedo. The Americans didn't know it existed. One word could launch it. One word could start World War III. His name was Vasili Alexandrovich Arkhipov. He was 36 years old, with the weathered face of a career naval officer, dark hair already graying at the temples, eyes that had seen too much in too few years. He wore the uniform of a Soviet Navy captain, but on this submarine he held a unique position. Flotilla commander, equal in authority to the captain himself. This technicality, this accident of rank, was about to become the most important detail in human history, because when the captain and political officer both voted to launch the nuclear weapon, Arkhipov alone had the power to say no. This is the story of the closest humanity has ever come to nuclear annihilation, of a decision made in darkness and heat and terror that saved billions of lives. It is the story of how one man's calm in the face of apocalypse changed everything. But to understand what happened in that submarine, we need to understand who Vasili Arkhipov was and why he alone could see clearly when everyone else had gone mad with fear. Before we continue, if you want more Cold War stories like this, the moments when everything hung by a thread and one person's choice changed history, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Arkhipov had joined the Soviet Navy in the 1940s, working his way up through the submarine service during the height of the Cold War. He was known for his calm under pressure, his technical expertise, his absolute refusal to panic no matter how dire the situation. But there was something else. Something that set him apart from every other officer on that submarine. He had already survived a nuclear disaster. Just 1 year earlier, in July 1961, Arkhipov had been aboard the submarine K-19 when its nuclear reactor cooling system failed. The reactor was approaching meltdown. Without coolant, it would explode, spreading radioactive contamination across the North Atlantic. The crew had no proper protective equipment, no training for this scenario. Officers and enlisted men took turns entering the reactor compartment, knowing they were absorbing lethal doses of radiation with every second they spent inside. They jury-rigged a new cooling system with their bare hands. It worked. The submarine survived. 22 crew members died slowly from radiation poisoning over the following weeks. Arkhipov lived, but he had seen what nuclear weapons could do to human flesh. He had watched men die cell by cell. He understood, in a way few others could, what nuclear war actually meant. So when he was assigned to submarine B-59 in October 1962, sent to the Caribbean as part of a secret Soviet deployment during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he carried that knowledge with him. The mission was supposed to be routine: reach Cuba, establish a Soviet naval presence, deter American aggression. But it went wrong almost immediately. The Americans detected the Soviet submarines and began tracking them aggressively. B-59 was forced to dive and stay submerged for days, unable to surface without risking detection. The submarine was not designed for extended tropical operations. It had no air conditioning. The nuclear reactor heated the interior to unbearable temperatures. The crew began to suffer. Communication with Moscow became impossible. They had no idea if war had already started, if Cuba had been invaded, if nuclear missiles were already in the air, and then the depth charges started falling. The American destroyers didn't know B-59 carried nuclear weapons. They were using practice charges, explosive devices designed to signal the submarine to surface, not to sink it. But inside B-59, the crew didn't know they were practice charges. They sounded like real weapons, Each explosion shook the submarine, sent men sprawling, added to the terror. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, was convinced they were under attack, that war had begun, that they were about to die. Soviet protocol was clear. In the event of war, if communication with command was lost, the submarine captain had authorization to use nuclear weapons. But there was a complication. The nuclear torpedo on B-59 was so powerful, so unprecedented, that Moscow had added an extra layer of control. 3 officers had to agree to launch it: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. Any one of them could veto the launch. Captain Savitsky wanted to launch. He was facing what he believed was certain death. His crew was suffering, his submarine was disabled, and he saw the nuclear torpedo as both a weapon and a statement. If they were going to die, they would take American ships with them. The political officer, Ivan Simonovich Maslenikov, agreed. The situation met the criteria. They had lost contact with Moscow. They were under attack. Launch was justified. Then they turned to Arkhipov. He was the third vote, the deciding vote. The scene inside that submarine must have been apocalyptic. Men shouting over the roar of failing systems, the heat unbearable, the explosions continuing overhead. The captain and political officer, both demanding action, both certain that war had begun, and Arkhipov, standing there in the toxic air, having to make a decision that would determine whether human civilization continued or ended. He said no. He refused to authorize the launch. His reasoning was simple but profound. They had no confirmation that war had actually begun. The depth charges might be signals, not attacks. Launching a nuclear weapon without absolute certainty would be murder on an incomprehensible scale. Better to surface, better to surrender, better even to die than to start a nuclear war based on an assumption. The argument lasted for hours. Savitsky raged. The crew took sides. Some officers supported Arkipov's caution. Others thought he was condemning them all to death. But Arkipov's rank made him equal to the captain, and his experience, his reputation, his unshakable calm in crisis gave him an authority that transcended the command structure. Finally, Savitsky relented. B-59 would surface. When the submarine broke the surface, the crew discovered the truth. There was no war. The depth charges had been signals. The American destroyers were trying to force them up, not sink them. The world was still at peace, though barely. If that torpedo had launched, if an American carrier had been vaporized by a nuclear explosion, the response would have been immediate and overwhelming. The Cuban Missile Crisis would have become World War III. Hundreds of millions would have died in the first hours. Civilization as we know it would have ended. But it didn't, because one man said no. The aftermath was quiet, almost anticlimactic. B-59 returned to the Soviet Union. Arkhipov was not punished, but neither was he celebrated. The incident was classified, hidden behind layers of Cold War secrecy. For decades, almost no one knew how close the world had come to ending. Arkhipov continued his naval career, retiring as a vice admiral in the 1980s. He rarely spoke about what happened in that submarine. When asked, he would simply say he had done his duty, nothing more. The story only emerged in the 1990s after the Cold War ended, when Soviet records were declassified and American participants began comparing notes. Historians realized what had happened, how a single vote in a dying submarine had saved the world. The director of the National Security Archive, Thomas Blanton, later said that Arkhipov may well have saved the world. Arkhipov died in 1998 at the age of 72 from radiation-related kidney cancer, likely caused by his exposure during the K-19 disaster. He received few honors during his lifetime. There are no grand monuments to his decision. Most people have never heard his name. The man who saved the world died in relative obscurity, his greatest achievement known to almost no one. But his lesson echoes across time. In the moment of maximum crisis, when everyone is screaming for action, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse. Sometimes saying no, even when it seems like cowardice, even when your peers are demanding yes, is the hardest and most important choice you can make. Arkhipov had every excuse to vote for launch. He was suffering. His crew was dying. The enemy seemed to be attacking. History would have understood. He said no anyway. Vasili Arkhipov, the man who saved the world with a single word, the officer who kept his head when everyone else had lost theirs, the voice of reason in a submarine filled with panic and rage. History forgot him. The billions of people who lived because of him never knew his name. But on October 27, 1962, in the suffocating heat of a Soviet submarine, one man's refusal to end the world made all the difference. Sometimes the greatest heroes are not the ones who act, but the ones who refuse to. Sometimes courage means standing alone and saying no, even when the whole world is screaming yes.